So you've probably all heard by now that last week we reached an important milestone in our impacts on the biosphere and atmosphere. And for the first time in human existence, the atmosphere is at 400, or CO2 in the atmosphere is at 400 parts per million. So roughly 17% of global carbon emissions, though, are attributable to deforestation and forest degradation. And the majority of forest loss, as you probably also know, is taking place in the most biodiverse forests on the planet. These facts generate concern on many fronts, and researchers and policymakers have been struggling to address them for over 2 decades now. We recognize the need for policy to safeguard biodiversity and to limit CO2 emissions because of the work of many scientists who have been studying the causes and consequences of deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, even before there was momentum toward policy. Today, we're extremely fortunate to have 4 speakers here who can help us tie these ideas together and share insights on the demands and challenges that lie ahead. The title of this conference comes from the recognition that climate policy is innovating tactics to reduce CO2 emissions and increase carbon sequestration, while biodiversity conservation does not command the same global attention. This is likely due to a variety of reasons. Changes in the atmosphere will have measurable effects on us all, while the extinction, for example, of the Java rhino in Vietnam in 2011 may go largely unnoticed and unremarked upon. In addition, carbon markets create a financial incentive for conservation, which, idealism aside, is often what is required to effect widespread change. This next figure shows us locations around the world that contain a highly threatened species according to the IUCN Red List. The sites in yellow already have some degree of protection, but the majority of sites, those in red, are unprotected. And another thing you may notice is that the overwhelming majority of these sites are located in tropical regions. On this map, we see terrestrial carbon stocks, and it's easy to see that there's a large overlap in the regions then that require biodiversity conservation and offer opportunities for carbon sequestration and storage. So during the last 5 years, there's been a lot of positive, truly innovative policy creation to protect and increase forest carbon stocks. The concept of an international policy for reducing CO2 emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries was approved as the UN program in 2008. This was a great and highly innovative step forward for limiting atmospheric carbon. In addition, it was immediately recognized that increasing forest carbon stocks or preventing the release of carbon from forests without consideration of biodiversity could have severe unintended consequences. Later work on REDD therefore states that, quote, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries can promote co-benefits and may complement the aims and objectives of other relevant international conventions and agreements. These co-benefits can include the protection of biodiversity in forests that are being managed as carbon reserves. That's extremely important because even if you never personally experience the amphibians or plants that are going extinct, they're all interconnected parts of tightly functioning ecosystems with lengthy evolutionary histories. Biodiversity is key to ecosystem functioning, and beyond our quantification of its role or purpose, each species has an intrinsic right to its existence. REDD was then extended to REDD Plus in 2010 as a far-sighted movement toward a holistic policy to combine the needs to reduce atmospheric CO2 and to ensure the protection of biodiversity. We're therefore at a point at which we have both a scientific understanding of tropical forest biodiversity and its relationship to tropical forest functioning and stability. And we also have the policy tools to simultaneously address climate change and biodiversity conservation. And so our next speaker will be Dr. David Wilcove, Professor of Public Affairs and Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Dr. Wilcove has dedicated his research to endangered species conservation, and he's an expert on North American wildlife conservation and also works extensively in the forests of Southeast Asia to understand the response of species to the pressures of logging and oil palm agriculture. Dr. Wilcove's work makes important contributions to conservation biology, and he's also recently completed informative economic analyses of the costs of conservation in Southeast Asia. Before moving to Princeton, Dr. Wilcove was the senior ecologist at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he worked on policy aspects of protecting endangered species. He was also the senior ecologist at the Wilderness Society, where he was instrumental in informing the Clinton administration's Northwest Forest Plan. He served on the boards of directors for conservation agencies, including the Rare Center for Tropical Conservation, the American Bird Conservancy, the Society for Conservation Biology. He's published widely in scientific and popular literature and is the author of The Condor's Shadow, The Loss and Recovery of Wildlife in America. Today, Dr. Wilcove will speak on conservation in Southeast Asia in the face of expanding oil palm agriculture.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'd like to shift the geographical focus a bit. I want to talk a bit about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing in Southeast Asia. So it's really going to be an examination of the impacts of both logging and conversion of forests to oil palm plantations in Borneo, in Malaysian Borneo in particular. But I want to actually begin the story in the middle, going back a couple of years ago when, in a moment of profound environmental conscience, I wanted to buy some cookies that did not contain palm oil. And, all righty.
Because if you hit that, it changes it.
Oh, I see. I hit the wrong one. Okay.
That's okay.
No problem. Are we back? All righty. So I went to the store, began by looking at more of the upper end cookies that I enjoy. It couldn't buy any of them. They all had palm oil. So I then decided to ratchet down a little bit. They all had palm oil. So I said, all right, fine. I'll skip the cookies. I'll go to ice cream, my other great passion in life. Man, palm oil. Even Ben & Jerry's palm oil. Even if I could have found the ice cream that didn't have palm oil, there was palm oil in the cones. There was palm oil in the faux chocolate sauce. It was everywhere. And that gives you a sense of the dilemma I faced in trying to be virtuous in the face of the research we've done. So the reason I got into this jam to begin with was due to a former graduate student of mine, Lian Pin Ko, who is currently at the Swiss Institute of Technology. And Pin came to Princeton from the National University of Singapore and announced that he wanted to figure out how to reconcile palm oil production with forest conservation in Southeast Asia, which was an issue that he was quite familiar with, living in Singapore and traveling in Malaysia and Indonesia. But I, who had never been to this part of the world, had never even thought about this issue. It really wasn't on my radar screen. And so going back about 8 years or so, it was through PIN that I became interested in the question that has occupied much of my time and attention over the last 8 years and continues to do so. So a little bit about palm oil, why PIN was interested in studying it, and why I was eager to avoid it. It is native to coastal West Africa. It's been cultivated for thousands of years and is currently planted really around the world. The vast majority of the palm oil that is produced today is used as a food additive, but about 20% of it is used in various industrial processes and cosmetics and soaps, and unfortunately, there's also a growing interest in using it as a biofuel. And I say unfortunate because when you look where palm oil is cultivated, it is a tropical plant The main producers are Malaysia, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Thailand's also a fairly significant one. And together, these main countries probably at present account for something on the order of about 90% of the production of oil palm. But as you will note, being a tropical plant, there's no small amount of overlap between where it's grown and areas that are increasingly recognized as hotspots of biodiversity, where we define hotspots, as Myers did, as places that combine high amounts of endemism of plants and animals with high rates of forest loss. And it is a crop whose expanse is constantly increasing. To give you an example, the amount of land that is devoted to oil palm cultivation from 1961 to about 2007. We'll look at the major countries here: Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria. And you can see, particularly in Southeast Asia, the tremendous expansion of the crop. We recently did some work with satellite imagery, and we calculate that in Southeast Asia, by 2010, about 70% of Sundaland, so the Malaysian Peninsula, the tip of the Malaysian Peninsula, Sumatra, Borneo, Java, about 70% of the lowland forests had been converted to agriculture. Most of that agriculture is oil palm. And at least over the past decade, the forests continue to disappear at an alarming rate, especially the peat swamp forests, which we estimate are disappearing at a rate of close to 4% per year. And again, the main driver of this has been oil palm. So one of the early questions we tackled, one that frankly would have seemed self-obvious to most biologists who had visited oil palm plantations, but was nonetheless not well explored, was simply the question: how does oil palm affect biodiversity? And this was driven in part by an assertion that the governments of Malaysia and Indonesia were making, backed up by the oil palm growers, that we should not think of oil palm as a crop in the way we think of, say, corn or soy. We should think of it as a tree. We should think of oil palm plantations as, for want of a better description, just an alternative type of forest. And so one of the early things that Pin did was to look at biodiversity in primary forests, log forests, rubber plantations, and oil palm plantations. Looking at two taxa, birds and butterflies, using some of his own field work and also compiling published studies. And the results were pretty dramatic. So if we take the pool of species in the primary forest, and we'll look first at birds, you can see that the logging of the primary forest, and this is a selective logging, I'll get back to what that means. It's not quite as benign as it sounds, but it's not a clear cutting, results in a reduction of some of the species. But in turn, if you then convert the log forest to either a rubber plantation or an oil palm, you get quite a dramatic reduction in forest species. Not surprisingly, those that are able to persist in rubber plantations are, by and large, able to persist in oil palm as well. And the pattern for butterflies was, again, fairly similar, that the logging certainly reduced the number of forest-dwelling butterflies, but the real drop came with the conversion of the land to oil palm. A very simple metric, but one that gives you a sense of the magnitude of the biodiversity losses associated with converting Southeast Asian forests into oil palm plantations. So in terms of whether the issue of oil palm posed a threat to biodiversity, we were certainly convinced that it was. And our main concern is the conversion of either primary or log forests to oil palm. We had less concern about converting, say, rubber plantations to oil palm, because the rubber plantations had already lost a significant fraction of their biodiversity. So given that, the question comes up, what do you do about it? What could be done? And I think there are really two ways to look at this. Oops, go back here. The first option is to see if we can make the oil palm plantations themselves more hospitable to biodiversity. And this is sometimes referred to as a land sharing approach to reconciling biodiversity with human needs for products from the land. And the second option is to prevent forests from being converted to oil palm, which is sometimes referred to as the land-sparing option. So this was something that we looked at as well. And Liam Pinco went and worked on a number of oil palm plantations. Some of the plantations will actively plant certain flowering plants within the oil palm stands with the hope of attracting some of the insects that function as natural predators of the beetles that prey upon the young oil palm. This is one step that within a plantation you can see some of these activities. And then there are other plantations that will leave some forest remnants within the oil palm. So one of the things he did was to look at how various combinations of these actions affect the diversity of birds and butterflies. I won't take you through all of his results because they basically all pointed to the same thing, looking at birds and butterflies, which is, with a huge amount of variation, it doesn't do anything. You know, you might, for example, with butterflies, the best predictor of butterfly species richness on an oil palm plantation is the percentage weed cover in the understory. And basically, you can load up with weeds and you might pick up a couple more butterfly species. But it's all dancing around the margins. It really doesn't in any way compensate for the tremendous reduction in biodiversity. And we've looked at increasing the size of the forest fragments, again, within the realm of practicability, what oil palm growers are likely to do. It doesn't get you anywhere. Basically, you can't make a biodiversity-friendly oil palm plantation any more than you can create a biodiversity-friendly soybean field in the Amazon. So we are highly skeptical that in terms of biodiversity, this is a particularly profitable route to follow. And just to summarize that point. So if we reject option one, the land sharing, then we come to option two. Can we stop forests from being converted to oil palm? And from a policy perspective, that proves to be a real challenge for a number of reasons. First, it is a very profitable crop. We've done various estimates and looked at others in the literature, and our sense is that the net present value of an oil palm plantation through a full cycle, which is about 30 years from the time you first plant the seedlings until the time you ultimately cut down the oil palm and return it to the soil because the trees have grown too tall to make it easy to harvest the fruit, during that sort of 30-year cycle, the net present value per hectare is anywhere from about $4,000 to $11,000 per hectare. Second, as I found during my foray into the store to look for ice cream and cookies, oil palm is used in thousands and thousands of products. It is not something akin to, say, canned tuna, where you could effectively organize a boycott. Because if you ask people to boycott oil palm, you would, in essence, be asking them to look on the ingredients of just about everything they buy in the supermarket, and it's doubtful that you could get people to do that. Another factor is that by far the biggest markets today for the product are in India and China, two countries with a far less active and influential environmental movement than we see, say, in Western Europe or the United States. And lastly, because many, but not all, of the oil palm growers do provide housing, schooling, medical care to their workers, it's hard to portray oil palm as being damaging socially to the country. In fact, I think you can make a case that in many, if not most cases, it's socially beneficial, apart from the very significant environmental costs. To give you a better sense of the esteem with which oil palm is held, this is the 50 ringgit note from Malaysia, which has the first leader of contemporary Malaysia saluting what appears to be an organic chemistry model and an oil palm. It's deeply incorporated into the economic fabric of Malaysia and Indonesia. But having said that, something that I hope we will talk about later in the afternoon, I do see some encouraging signs of progress here, arguably not fast enough, but nonetheless, a number of the NGOs have been working with some of the big oil palm purchasers and producers, companies like Cargill, in terms of the siting of future oil palm plantations and things like that. There is also a roundtable on sustainable palm oil, which is run, it's basically a group of producers, NGOs, government officials, trying to develop some standards that would constitute sustainable palm oil. From my point of view, the most important thing they can do in biodiversity is to pledge not to clear more forests. Anything beyond that is frosting on the cake. The cake, though, remains not growing oil palm by clearing more forests. So this is a photograph I took with my cell phone not too long ago in the Danam Valley of Sabah, Malaysian Borneo. And it's a convoy of 27 logging trucks carrying the Danam Valley out of the Danam Valley. And logging is the other pervasive land use issue here. Because certainly in Sabah and really throughout Southeast Asia, what forests remain, the forests that aren't being converted to oil palm, are by and large open to logging. And there has been a sense that heavy logging of these forests more or less renders them close to worthless for biodiversity. And they become sort of the expendable wastelands that are no longer worth worrying about. And that was a question that I got interested in after we had done the preliminary work, when I began to realize that we just had this odd category of logged forest, that we really weren't looking more closely at the intensity of logging and how that affects biodiversity, and there really wasn't that much of a literature on it. And so for a couple of years then we looked more closely at that, and I was able to bring together really a wonderful group of collaborators. They included David Edwards, who was about to take on a faculty position at the University of Sheffield, one of the top ornithologists for Southeast Asia, just an extraordinarily good field man. Trond Larsen with Conservation International now, very gifted conservation scientist with deep expertise in dung beetles. Wayne Su, who worked with us, who is keenly interested in both birds and dung beetles. And so one of the projects we did, again focusing on Saba where we had access, was to look at how bird and dung beetle communities varied between the unlogged forest, forests that had been logged once, forests that had been logged twice. And to give you a slightly better idea of what I mean, in the first rotation in Saba, in this part of Saba, which isn't all that different from what goes on in many other places in Southeast Asia, they basically go in and they target all commercially valuable trees with a diameter at breast height of 60 centimeters or more. In the mixed dipterocarp forest that we're dealing with, virtually all of the trees are of commercial value. So they end up taking out virtually all of the trees that are greater than 60 centimeters DBH. If they followed their logging plans, they would leave these forests alone for a couple more decades and then go in for a second cut. Usually they don't wait that long, and they go back in, and in the second cut, oops, let me go back here. In the second cut, they remove all of the trees with DBHs of 40 centimeters or more. So you end up at that stage with a rather sparsely forested site consisting almost entirely of small trees. And so we looked at the Dan Valley. We set up a set of study sites in the primary forest, the once logged and the twice logged forest. Here's the northeastern corner of Saba. There's the Danum Valley Primary Forest Reserve, and you can see the areas that have been logged once and twice surrounding it. We surveyed the birds using both point counts, where the observer, in this case David, records by eye, by ear, all of the birds that he sees or hears within standing in a fixed point. And we also used mist nets to sample birds, because that gives you a better read on some of the shyer understory birds and is in some ways, well, to a large extent, independent of the observer's skill in recording the birds, although I have to say David's skill with Southeast Asian birds is pretty close to phenomenal. The dung beetles, we followed the standard protocol of using baited pit traps. So just to walk you through some of the differences here, if we look at observed species richness, and here are the accumulation curves that we obtain for birds in the unlogged, once logged, twice logged forests, basically, whether it's all of the birds that we can observe and hear with the point counts or the understory birds that are captured via mist nets, there really is no major difference in species richness. That the logged forests are surprisingly rich in species. Now, conservation is not as much about quantity as it is about quality, in the sense that the big concern, of course, would be species that are imperiled or restricted to forests. And so when we break this down further and we look at red-listed birds and birds that are known to be forest dependent, and we look at the mean species richness in point counts and mist nets in the once logged, twice logged, and unlogged forests, there is unquestionably a drop there. We certainly would not argue that the log forests are as important as the primary forest for these birds of high conservation priority. But it's also the case that the log forests are far from a wasteland for these species, and that they retain, to our eyes at least, surprisingly large numbers, large diversity of those species. Dung beetles are interesting. So we don't know which dung beetles we should regard as endangered. The red list for dung beetles has not been built yet. So we can only look at the species accumulation. But when we do that, they do appear to be, interestingly enough, more sensitive to the logging than the birds. And so the accumulation curve for dung beetles in the primary forest is significantly different from the accumulation of dung beetles in the once-logged and twice-logged forests, although the once-logged and twice-logged forests do not differ from each other in any notable way. So if we look at the pool of forest-dwelling species on the assumption that since forests are what are being lost throughout this region, we want to focus on preserving those, we find that with birds, about 30% of forest-dwelling birds decline or disappear after the first cut. 7% of the bird species that we're dealing with appear to be restricted to the unlogged forest. With dung beetles, about half of the species decline or disappear after the first cut. About 11% of them seem to be restricted to the unlogged forest. But what took us by surprise is that about 3/4 of the species of both birds and dung beetles that we find in the primary forests will persist in the twice-logged forests. Perhaps at reduced densities, often at reduced densities, but they will persist. Which led us to believe that even these rather savagely logged lands are not biological wastelands. A question that we are justifiably asked about this often is whether what we were seeing was in essence a rescue effect. That is, are we seeing a spillover of birds and dung beetles from the primary forest into these logged forests, and that absent the primary forest, these species would not be able to persist in the log forests. We think a rescue effect per se is unlikely to be the case. We're picking up pretty high densities of many of the birds and dung beetles in the twice-logged forests. At least among the birds, we're seeing a fair amount of singing, suggesting territoriality. We're spotting fledglings as well in the log forests, suggesting successful breeding. And it's worth noting that our sites are anywhere from 1 kilometer to 90 kilometers away from the nearest primary forest. And there is no relationship between the density of a particular species in the log forest and its proximity to the nearest primary forest. And then just lastly, in the landscape that we're working in, which is the 1 million hectare logging concession, only about 10% of that is actually primary forest. So we're really working in a landscape that is largely logged forest, and yet we're still seeing these species. So we don't think it's a rescue effect, but there could be an extinction debt here. It's possible that some of the birds and dung beetles that we observe in the logged forest, particularly in the twice-logged forests, may over time disappear. We don't know. Conversely, as these forests mature, depending on the trajectory of succession, we could also see them increasing in density. So it's something that will bear watching in the coming decades. I want to keep the focus my presentation largely on the ecology of this, but I will take just a few moments to talk about a little bit about the economics, because that's something we're going to be discussing this afternoon with folks who are really deeply involved in that side of it, but it is an issue that we have looked at as well. So if we think about the costs of conservation, I think there are two components to that. There's the ecological component, where you measure the loss of biodiversity that comes from the activities that you're studying. And then, of course, there's the economic component, which, crudely speaking, I think for the forests in Southeast Asia, we can describe as the value of the timber on the site, the value of the site for oil palm, if it's converted to oil palm, minus whatever value the forest has for ecosystem services. And so we've done a fair amount of work to try to put together that economic component as well. This is work that has been done largely by Brendan Fisher, a wonderful natural resource economist who worked with us for a couple of years, is now at the World Wildlife Fund. And he was able to do a lot of this work because the ornithologist, David Edwards, had somehow managed to talk his way into the regional forestry office and photocopied a small suitcase full of logging records, which meant that we knew for about 200,000 hectares, we had a record of every tree that was removed by the loggers, down to species and diameter. And so combining that with the value of the different species on the market, Brendan could begin to put together the economic picture here. And we did our own calculations, and then we also we looked at other similar work, although we felt that we had probably the best data set. So the value of the site for its timber and for its potential for oil palm can be represented by these two stacked boxes here. And these are the accumulative means from our study and all of the other studies we've been able to put together from Southeast Asia. This is the range, actually, from the lowest to the highest values that we recorded. And you would then hope, in a perfect world, that the value of the site for ecosystem services would equal that. We looked at the carbon market, and then we looked at two others. We looked at watershed value and ecotourism value. Now, there could be others, non-timber forest products and things. We don't see a lot of that in Southeast Asia. And we could come up with pretty good estimates for the carbon market, and other studies have done. For other payments for ecosystem services, again, we focused mostly on watershed protection, and we focused on ecotourism. We simply looked at all studies that had been done anywhere in the tropics, New World or Old World, and took the highest value we could find. And the point we want to make is, most of the time, you don't get close. That we're not going to be able to preserve the primary forests, the remaining primary forests of Southeast Asia, if the land use decisions are largely based on straightforward economic considerations. But one of the striking things is how rapidly the value of the remaining standing timber drops with each logging rotation. So again, in the area that we're working in Sabah, we estimate that the standing timber in an unlogged forest is worth about $10,000 per hectare. That's at the upper end of the values that others have gotten elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So we're dealing, we think, with especially fine dipterocarp forests. After the first round of selective logging, the value of the standing timber drops to about $4,000 per hectare. After that second round, it's about $2,000 per hectare. So what's interesting is to see how the ecological cost changes relative to the economic cost. So if we use the primary forest, the unlogged forest, as our baseline, and we look to see how the timber value changes, here's that drop-off that I talked about. That after the first logging rotation, it's about 35% of the primary forest value. After the second, it's around 20% or so. And you remember the earlier data that I showed you about the persistence of birds and dung beetles in logged forests. Again, from that community of species that are present in the primary forest, the drop-off is much less. And so one of the things we've been arguing is that this gap here may present something of an opportunity in conservation. Not the dream opportunity, because the dream opportunity is always in protecting the primary forest, but nonetheless a chance to protect log forests as a cost-effective way to enlarge the existing reserves, which there aren't many, to connect reserves, or arguably to create new reserves altogether, particularly on sites that, by virtue of topography, are unsuitable for oil palm, where you can eliminate that part of the cost equation as well. And I think a big question is to what extent this may be true elsewhere in the tropics, because I certainly do not want to extrapolate beyond Southeast Asia here. But what is the impact of selective logging in neotropical forests, afrotropical forests, and what are the costs and benefits associated with protecting them? Just want to close by acknowledging the wonderful group of people I've been able to work with over the years and my major funding source. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, we have time for some questions.
Yes?
So if, I'm guessing that these logged forests, but they don't support any large mammals, so the orangs are gone, obviously now, the rhinos are not supported there. If you combine the first talk we heard and this one, what would they do? I mean, is there a concern that the biodiversity that is maintained in these secondary forests is not sustainable?
So the situation, at least in Sabah, is somewhat different. The rhinos are definitely essentially gone. The intensity of hunting is, I think, probably less than in many of the areas where John was working. So you still find, even in the log forest, evidence that bantang, the large forest bovid, persists. We see orangs from time to time. So the hornbills are there, although we don't know at what densities because they have such enormous home ranges. It's hard to tell what areas they're just ignoring versus what areas they're actually using. So I would say that I don't want to assume that these forests are completely devoid of the large fruit dispersers, the large herbivores. But obviously, to the extent that they are, that would have a real impact in the long term on the health of these forests, probably not in terms of the dipterocarp trees themselves, but in terms of the others, and that would be a significant concern. Yes?
A couple things. So you hear stories, and I've seen oil palm in Latin America, but it certainly hasn't exploded as it has in Southeast Asia and Nigeria. Why? That's one question, and then the other one is that comparison of ecosystem services, including carbon value to oil palm and logging. How does that change on peatland forests?
So why it hasn't spread as in the same pestilential fashion it has in Southeast Asia, I don't know. I'm aware of no reason why it couldn't. Particularly if the market for biofuels develops. And also, the primary use of oil palm in food is actually as a cooking oil. And it does seem to me as though whenever people gain a little extra money, very poor people gain a little extra money, one of the things they buy is cooking oil. So I would actually be concerned about the long-term prospects in places like Colombia, Ecuador, from the spread of oil palm. Your second question, Steve?
Peat forests.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So they are disappearing at an extraordinary rate, largely because they're being converted to oil palm. The timber value on the peat swamp forest looks to be significantly less. There are a few dipterocarps that grow well there that are in demand, but that would be a case where I think the conservation costs of saving the primary forest are significantly lower because of lower timber value. The value for oil palm is about the same. They might incur some extra costs in the context of prepping the site and draining the site. So I hold out some hope for that, other than the fact that they've already lost so much of the peat swamp forest. And we have another project going on in peat swamp, and the only place we've been able to access intact peat swamp has been in Brunei because of their oil wealth. They've felt no need to exploit their peat swamp forests. So it may almost be too late to do too much with the peat swamp forests. Yes, ma'am?
Did you ever explore areas where tree disease had a higher impact than logging?
No, we didn't. And that would be a neat project. But we've always been in areas where the forests were reasonably healthy and the big issue was logging and then ultimately conversion. Yes?
So what kind of regulations do they have in Savo with respect to the large palm plantations actually leaving any intact forest on their land?
There are, there's an interest in what's called high conservation value forests, which are at least to get certification through the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil. You have to identify them and protect them. The problem is they're borrowing a concept that was originally applied to forestry, where you would identify those, if you were going to go into a primary forest and do your first round of logging, you would go in and you're supposed to identify the patches of primary forest that either have endangered species in them or important cultural attributes or things like that. And then you weren't supposed to log those areas, but you could log around them. But what you end up with in forestry then is patches of primary forest in a matrix of logged forest. When they apply that concept to oil palm, you end up with patches of primary forest surrounded by an oil palm plantation. The matrix is so much more inhospitable with oil palm that we really don't think it accomplishes that much.
So my question on that was, I've talked to other people who work in this area and I know nothing about it in Southeast Asia. And I was interested in whether or not the measure of protection provided by being surrounded by oil palm is actually maybe in some cases greater than the measure of protection that you would have if you were outside a plantation where people can go, I mean, along the lines of John's comments about going in and hunting and things like that. I've always wondered whether that's
Yeah, again, I don't want to talk about places like Vietnam where we haven't worked and where I know hunting is severe. Hunting doesn't seem to be the driver in Sabah, in Malaysia in general, that it is elsewhere. So you're trading off, you're still getting a bad deal out of it.
No,
Yeah.
I'm disagreeing. I'm just wondering, and particularly because you pointed out that it may be because they all have jobs in the oil palm plantations. I mean, this is
Yeah.
an interesting trade-off with respect to this. I think the same thing happens in Atlantic forest in Brazil with sugarcane. A lot of the northern patches of Atlantic forest are on big sugarcane plantations, and the only reason there's probably still forest there is because there was a sugarcane plantation guarding it. And so I just think it's an interesting.
Yeah. I mean, one of the arguments we've made is that rather than worrying about on-site mitigation, like I'm going to convert this patch of forest, this area of forest to oil palm, but I'll agree to leave 20%, 30%, whatever, as forest. You really ought to be practicing off-site mitigation where there's a much larger area that everyone is essentially contributing to the conservation of. And so you more or less sacrifice the biodiversity in the areas that are converted to oil palm. You're not even making much of an effort to keep the forest-sensitive species there. But in turn, you're building a large forest reserve outside the realm of the oil palm. The one exception to that I would push for, and we're just finishing up in the next year some work on that, is we have some evidence that buffers, forest buffers along streams, are critical to maintaining the fish communities. And that if they don't leave those buffers, it's very bad news for the fish. Whether those buffers are providing modes of transport for terrestrial animals or not, we don't know. We just haven't done the work on that. If so, that would make them even more beneficial. John.
Okay, I'm just wondering, in respect to the logged forests, are they part of a permanent forest estate? Are they privately owned or publicly owned? And does Malaysia have a policy to define permanent forest estate, something like our national forest?
The concession, million-hectare concession we're working in is a government-owned forest. So in theory, it should always remain as forest land akin to a national forest in the United States. I wouldn't bet my house on that happening, but that's the intention, that they will not convert it. What happens elsewhere in Southeast Asia, I think, say in parts of Indonesia where we haven't worked, or Cambodia, Vietnam, I don't know. Yes?
So in terms of, your main recommendation was, let's not convert standing forests to oil palms. And are there mechanisms in place in Southeast Asia that are ensuring that that doesn't happen? And I ask because in Peru, northern Peru, what we're seeing right now is that is what's happening, is that primary forest is being converted to
Yeah.
oil palms, and you can see it, even it's documented from space now that people are doing this. So what sorts of things are in place to ensure that?
So in terms of governmental restrictions on that, I don't see a lot. Where I think I'm seeing progress is in pressure on the large purchasers and producers of oil palm, where they commit to, by virtue of, so the producers commit to expanding future plantations only on non-forested lands. And then we'll get into a debate about what a non-forested land is. But that's something that has happened. And then the other area is trying to get some of the certification programs to insist on that as a requirement for certification, that all plantations established after X year must be on non-forested land. But, you know, there's oil palm is expanding in New Guinea, and it's got to be expanding in on forests because that's what's there. And so I think we're going to see a continuation of forest loss due to oil palm for some time to come, and it's a troubling trend.
What we're seeing is that small-scale agriculturalists get permission to clear forest for agriculture, and then they actually sell that permission to big oil palm groups.
And this is in northern Peru.
Yeah.
Boy. Yes?
I'm wondering if public health is involved in the discussion, because palm oil is used in a lot of foods that are linked to obesity, and there are a lot of high direct and indirect costs of obesity that are being,
Yeah.
the controversies are real.
Yeah, no, that's true. And that might be one way you would actually get consumers to look at what's in the food they purchase. If sort of palm oil had the stigma of trans fats or something like that. I don't know that any of the countries that are either the major producers of palm oil or the major destinations, specifically China and India, I haven't gotten a sense that they're particularly worried about that. But maybe in the wealthier communities, there's a stronger desire to go to olive oil and things like that. But those are much more expensive.
So it might be worthwhile to talk with the ministries of health in these countries to find out what they think about it.
That's an interesting idea. We haven't done that. It's a very interesting idea. Yes?
I think, as you were saying, there's a really huge growth and interest in palm oil as a sustainable fuel. And I just wonder if anyone's done any work on the relative carbon costs of conversion versus the carbon benefits of palm oil as a sustainable biofuel. So
it's not a topic that my group has looked at in any great detail, but I've been talking to some people who've looked at it. What I've learned from them is that let's separate two things. First, just how much potential biofuel you get from a hectare of oil palm, and that's apparently a great deal. It's a wonderful crop in that context. Now, how does the carbon savings associated with that compare to what happens when you clear a primary forest? The payback time has been calculated, I think, by Holly Gibbs and others, and it's astronomical. So if they're clearing forests to grow palm oil and asserting that they are doing that to create a green fuel, no way. Now, if you had land that had already been cleared and you were looking to expand biofuels, you might think in that context of oil palm as a reasonable crop to put in there. Yes, sir?
In Malaysia, who are the farmers and who owns the plantations, and what scale is economical?
Yeah.
So where's the investment capital come?
Yeah. So it seems to be, at least in Malaysia, it seems to be bimodal, that the bulk of the oil palm plantations are owned by a small number of big companies like KLK, Musim Mas, and others that own thousands upon thousands of hectares of oil palms scattered often in different countries, different parts of the country. And then there's a second group of people who are the small-scale owners, and they own, tens of hectares, say, and plant oil palm there, and then try to be part of the supply line into the big processing plants, which are often owned by the large plantation owners themselves. So what I don't think we have a lot of are sort of intermediate scale oil palm producers. All righty.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.